My name is Anna, and if someone had told me a few years ago that I would one day share a story about betrayal, I would have laughed it off. I always saw myself as the kind of person for whom loyalty was non-negotiable. In my head, love was supposed to be pure, unconditional, and absolute. I thought cheating only happened to people who weren't truly in love, or who didn't know what commitment meant. But life has a way of testing you exactly where you feel most confident. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other. My parents were simple, kind people. My mom was an elementary school teacher, and my dad worked as an engineer. They had been together since they were young, and for me, they were the model of what marriage should look like. I grew up watching how my father always cared for my mother, how they laughed together at the little things. I remember my mom once told me, "Anna, trust is the foundation. If you have that, everything else will fall into place." Those words stayed with me. At school, I wasn't the most outgoing kid. I was quiet, loved reading, writing in my journal, and dreaming about the future. I had a small circle of close friends, and we shared secrets and plans about how our lives would turn out. Most of them started dating early, having those typical high school relationships. I, on the other hand, stayed on the sidelines, waiting for something different. For me, love had to feel special, like in the movies or in books. Not casual, not fleeting, but real. After graduation, I moved to a bigger city to attend university. That's where my independent life truly began. I rented a small room, in a dorm, worked part-time at a cafe to cover expenses, and tried to juggle classes with making a life of my own. I actually loved the chaos of it all, the mix of new faces, late-night conversations, and the sense that anything could happen. Despite the new environment, I was still the same girl deep down, searching for something meaningful. I saw how many of my classmates dated casually, jumping from one partner to another without much thought. That was never me. I believed in building something lasting, something based on respect and honesty. The first 2 years at university went by in a blur, studying, working, occasional parties. There were moments I felt lonely, especially when my friends talked about their relationships. Still, I believed my time would come. And, as life often works, it happened when I least expected it. That meeting, completely random at first, would go on to change everything. It would bring me love, joy, doubt, and eventually, the deepest guilt I'd ever felt. But before that, it's important to admit something. If someone had asked me back then what I feared most in a relationship, I would have answered without hesitation: betrayal. To me, betrayal was worse than heartbreak, worse than any fight or breakup. The cruel irony is that one day I would become the betrayer. Back then, though, I was still living in the illusion that my life would follow a straight, clear path, like one of those neat storylines you read in a childhood book: a beginning, a middle, and an end. What I didn't realize yet was that the heart doesn't follow logic, and love doesn't always fit the rules you set for it. I met Igor in the most ordinary way, which is ironic considering how extraordinary his role in my life would become. It wasn't some cinematic moment under the rain, nor a dramatic accident where our eyes locked. It was at a university library, of all places. I was exhausted after a long shift at the cafe and went there to finish an essay. My laptop charger had just died, and I was silently panicking when I heard a voice next to me. "Need a charger?" I turned, and there he was. Tall, dark hair slightly messy, wearing an old hoodie and jeans. There was nothing particularly striking about him at first glance, but his smile was disarming. Warm, casual, like he'd known me for years. I nodded, maybe a bit too quickly, and he handed me his charger with a small laugh. That was the beginning. Simple, harmless. We started talking that night, and conversation flowed with an ease I wasn't used to. Most of the time, I struggled with small talk, but with Igor, it felt natural. He was studying computer science, cracked dry jokes about professors, and asked me about my major. He seemed genuinely interested in what I said, and I caught myself smiling more than I usually did. When I packed up to leave, he walked me out. The streets were almost empty, and the cold air nipped at my face. He offered me his scarf, insisting even when I tried to refuse. It was such a small gesture, but it stuck with me. After that night, we kept running into each other, sometimes at the library, sometimes at the cafe where I worked, and eventually we started intentionally meeting. A coffee here, a quick walk after class, sitting together at lectures. I didn't even notice how seamlessly he became part of my routine. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't waiting anymore. It was happening. This was it, the thing I'd been hoping for since high school. Our first official date happened a few weeks later. He asked me if I wanted to go see a movie, and I remember agonizing over what to wear, even though he was the kind of guy who didn't seem to care about appearances. I still remember the way he looked at me when I walked into the theater lobby, like I was the only person there. It wasn't grand, it wasn't over the top, but it was real. That night, when he walked me back to my dorm, he hesitated before saying goodnight. For a second, I thought he'd kiss me, but he didn't. Instead, he just smiled and said, "Next time?" And for some reason, that made my heart race even more than an actual kiss would have. Of course, the next time did come. It happened on a quiet afternoon in the park. The sun was setting, and we were sitting on a bench talking about nothing important. He reached for my hand first. Then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, he leaned in and kissed me. I know it sounds cliché, but I swear in that moment, the world disappeared. All the noise, all the worries, gone. It felt like the universe had just whispered, "Here, this is yours." Looking back, I sometimes wonder if I fell in love with him that day, or if I had already been falling since the moment he offered me that charger. Either way, I was in, completely. What I didn't realize back then was how much weight comes with that kind of love. When you give yourself fully to someone, you open yourself up not only to happiness, but also to the possibility of hurting them in ways they don't deserve. But at that time, none of that mattered. All I knew was that Igor was the first person who made me feel like I belonged. If I had to describe the first months with Igor in one word, it would be effortless. Everything just seemed to fall into place, like the universe had conspired to give me exactly what I'd been waiting for. We spent hours together, sometimes doing nothing at all. He'd come over to my dorm with snacks, and we'd binge-watch old sitcoms until 2 in the morning, whispering jokes so we wouldn't wake up my roommate. Other times, we'd wander around the city with no destination, ending up in small coffee shops or sitting on bridges, legs dangling as we talked about the future. It wasn't perfect in the cinematic sense. He wasn't serenading me under my window or bringing me roses every week, but it was perfect in the real sense. The comfort, the inside jokes, the way I could sit in silence with him and not feel the need to fill the air. I remember one night especially clearly. It was snowing, the first real snow of the season, and we had been walking back from the grocery store with bags full of random snacks. The streetlights reflected off the fresh snow, and without thinking, I dropped the bags and started spinning in the street like a little kid. He laughed, called me ridiculous, then joined in. For a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the entire world. That was the kind of happiness I found with Igor. Simple, unpolished, but intoxicating. My friends noticed the change in me too. They teased me about always being glued to him, about how I smiled when his name came up in conversation. My parents, when I visited home, were relieved. My mom said she could hear the happiness in my voice. And my dad, usually a man of few words, actually pulled Igor aside the first time they met and shook his hand firmly. Later, Dad told me quietly, "I like him. He looks at you the right way." That meant more to me than anything. Of course, every relationship has its small imperfections. Igor could be stubborn, sometimes even a little arrogant about his opinions, and I, with my tendency to overthink everything, would occasionally get insecure about small things, if he took too long to text back, if he seemed distracted. But we always managed to talk it out. He had this way of pulling me close, kissing my forehead and telling me, "Stop making problems where there aren't any." And I would believe him. Looking back, I think those first months set the stage for everything that came later. Because when you experience that kind of pure happiness, it's almost impossible not to cling to it, not to fight for it when cracks begin to appear. And the cracks did come. Not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse, but slowly, like hairline fractures in glass. At first, I ignored them, told myself it was normal, that no relationship could stay in the honeymoon stage forever. I didn't know yet that it wasn't just time or routine that would test us. It would be me, my own choices, my own weakness. But at that point, I was still blissfully unaware. I was just a girl in love, convinced I had found the person who would walk through life with me. Every love story has its turning point. Ours didn't come crashing down in some dramatic fight. It started quietly, almost invisibly, like a faint sound you barely notice at first, but once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The first changes came when Igor's schedule got heavier. He picked up an internship in addition to his classes, and suddenly his time was stretched thin. I told myself it was normal, that he was building his future, that I should be proud. And I was proud. But I also missed him. The late-night walks, the lazy weekends, the endless hours of laughter. They slowly became rare, replaced by quick coffee meetups squeezed in between his commitments. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. How distracted he seemed sometimes, how his phone buzzed constantly with work emails, how he'd sigh when I suggested doing something spontaneous. It wasn't that he didn't care anymore. I knew he did. But his energy was elsewhere. And then there was me. My overthinking, my insecurities, the voice in my head that whispered, "What if you're not his priority anymore?" I hated that voice. It made me needy in ways I'd sworn I'd never be. I wanted to be the cool, supportive girlfriend, but instead I found myself second-guessing everything. One night, I brought it up. We were sitting in his tiny apartment, half-eaten pizza on the table, the TV playing some background noise we weren't paying attention to. "I feel like we don't spend as much time together anymore," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. He sighed, leaned back, and rubbed his eyes. "Anna, you know this internship is important. I'm doing this for us. For the future. I know," I whispered. I miss you." He pulled me close then, kissed my hair, told me he loved me, and I believed him. For a while, that was enough. But the cracks widened. I noticed myself getting lonelier. Nights felt longer when I was studying alone, when I walked past places we used to go and realized I was by myself. My friends, though supportive, couldn't fill the space he left. That was when the first tiny seed of restlessness planted itself inside me. I didn't recognize it at the time. It felt more like a dull ache than anything dangerous. But in hindsight, that's where it began. It's a strange thing, how easy it is to justify little changes. You tell yourself it's temporary, that it's just a phase, that love is supposed to withstand these things. And it is. But love also needs attention, and when attention fades, even the strongest bonds can fray. I still loved him. God, I loved him with every part of me. But love alone isn't always enough to keep the doubts away. And so, without realizing it, I started to look elsewhere for something I couldn't even define. Not love, not romance, but connection. That spark of being seen, understood, wanted. I didn't know it yet, but the next person who entered my life would offer me exactly that. And it would be the beginning of everything I swore I'd never do. His name was Alexei. I met him at work. By then, I had switched from the cafe to a part-time job as an assistant in a small marketing office. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid better and gave me experience I could put on my resume. Alexei was one of the junior managers, a couple of years older than me, confident in that easy way people in their mid-20s sometimes are. The first time we spoke, it was nothing, just him asking me to print some reports. He smiled politely, thanked me, and went back to his desk. But over time, our interactions grew. He had this way of making casual conversation feel meaningful. He'd ask about my classes, about the books I was reading, about my plans after graduation. He noticed things, little things, like when I changed my hairstyle or wore a new sweater. Igor never commented on those things anymore. At first, I dismissed it as harmless. After all, people are allowed to be friendly at work. But there was something in the way Alexei looked at me, in the pauses between his words, that felt different. And shamefully, I didn't mind. I think it was the attention that hooked me. After months of feeling like I was competing with Igor's internship, someone finally looked at me like I was the center of the room again. It was intoxicating. One evening, a group of us from the office went out for drinks after a long week. I hadn't planned to stay long, but Alexei sat next to me, and we talked for hours. About music, about growing up in small towns, about our frustrations with work. He made me laugh in that unfiltered, genuine way I hadn't laughed in a while. When I finally checked the time, it was past midnight. Walking home that night, guilt started creeping in. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I wanted to. That terrified me. I loved Igor. I still loved him with everything I had. But the thought of Alexei lingered in my mind longer than it should have. Over the next weeks, things escalated subtly. More shared jokes, more lingering conversations in the office kitchen, more texts that blurred the line between friendly and something else. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just enjoying harmless attention. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. One moment in particular stands out. We were staying late at the office. just the two of us, finishing a presentation. At some point, I leaned over his desk to look at something on his screen, and when I glanced up, our faces were inches apart. Neither of us moved for a second. The air felt heavier, like something unspoken was hanging there. Then he cleared his throat, smiled, and shifted back to his chair. It was such a small moment, but it shook me. That night, I went home and stared at my ceiling for hours, my heart pounding with confusion. I thought about Igor, his steady love, his dreams for the future, the way he kissed my forehead when I worried too much. And then I thought about Alexei, his attention, his charm, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in months. That was the first time I admitted to myself that I was standing on dangerous ground. I wish I could say I stopped it there, that I pulled back, refocused on my relationship, and stayed true to everything I believed in. But instead, I let the cracks widen. And step by step, I moved closer to the edge of a line I swore I'd never cross. Guilt is a strange thing. It creeps in quietly, like a shadow, and once it settles, it never really leaves. That's how I felt in those weeks after Alexei started becoming more than just a coworker to me. I hadn't done anything wrong yet. No kiss, no physical betrayal. But my heart knew better. The betrayal had already started, in my thoughts, in my cravings for attention, in the way I sometimes checked my phone hoping for Alexei's name instead of Igor's. And every time I realized it, I hated myself. With Igor, things were steady, but distant. He was drowning in his internship and schoolwork. When we saw each other, it was often rushed, grabbing coffee between his meetings or falling asleep on his couch while he typed away at his laptop. He still told me he loved me, but the spark we'd once had felt buried under exhaustion and routine. I kept telling myself, be patient. This is just a phase. But then there was Alexei, who seemed to exist solely to remind me of what I was missing. He was funny, attentive, and most dangerously, available. The real conflict wasn't about choosing between two men, it was between two versions of myself. The loyal girlfriend who believed in trust above all else, and the restless woman who craved to feel alive again. There were nights I would sit on my bed, phone in hand, debating whether to reply to Alexei's "can't sleep" text. I'd stare at the screen, knowing that every word I typed was pushing me closer to a place I swore I'd never go. Sometimes I resisted, sometimes I didn't. And when I didn't, our conversations grew more personal. He asked about my dreams, my insecurities, the things Igor hadn't asked me about in months. One evening, I tried to confess a little of what I was feeling. To Igor, not Alexei. I told him I felt like we were drifting apart, like we weren't really us anymore. He looked at me, tired, and said, "Anna, can't you just trust me? This is temporary. Once the internship is over, things will go back to normal." I nodded, but inside I felt something crack, because I realized I wasn't sure if I wanted normal anymore. The guilt became unbearable. I couldn't focus on classes. I couldn't sleep properly. Every time Igor kissed me, I wondered if he could taste the betrayal on my lips, even though it hadn't technically happened yet. And yet, I kept seeing Alexei. Coffee breaks, late nights in the office, text messages that lingered far past midnight. I told myself I was strong enough to stop, but deep down, I knew I was inching closer to something irreversible. It's terrifying how quickly you can cross a line. One moment, you're justifying harmless attention. The next, you're wondering how much longer you can keep pretending nothing is happening. I wish I could say I chose loyalty. I wish I could say I turned away and remembered who I was, the promises I'd made to myself, the love I knew I still had for Igor. But the truth is, I was already falling. And soon, there would be no turning back. It happened on a night that was supposed to be ordinary. That's the part that still haunts me, the fact that nothing about it was planned. No grand decision, no dramatic choice, just one ordinary night that changed everything. We were staying late at the office again, Alexei and I. Everyone else had already left. The building was quiet, and the glow of our screens painted the room in soft light. We were both exhausted, joking to keep ourselves awake as we finalized a presentation. At some point, I leaned back in my chair and groaned, "I can't stare at this spreadsheet anymore." He laughed, leaned back too, and for a moment we just sat there in silence. Then he said softly, "You work too hard. You deserve someone who takes care of you, you know?" The words hit me like a knife and a comfort at the same time, because that was the thing. I did have someone. Igor. The man I loved, the man who was sacrificing so much for our future. But in that moment, all I could feel was the emptiness his absence had left. And Alexei saw it. I looked at him, and he was already looking at me. That same charged pause we'd had weeks before. Only this time, neither of us pulled away. His hand brushed mine on the desk, tentative at first, then firmer. My chest tightened, every nerve in my body screaming that this was wrong, that this was the line. And then I crossed it. I leaned in. He leaned in. And suddenly his lips were on mine. The kiss was electric, hungry, desperate, the kind of kiss that feels like it's been waiting for weeks to happen. My mind went blank, drowned out by the rush of adrenaline and the heat of his hands pulling me closer. For a few moments, there was no guilt, no thought of Igor, no promises, just fire. But when we finally pulled apart, reality came crashing back. My stomach twisted, and the weight of what I'd just done nearly crushed me. I stumbled back, shaking my head. "I can't," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I shouldn't have." "Anna," Alexei said, his voice calm but firm, "you don't have to explain. I know what this means." But he didn't. He couldn't. Because for me, it meant betrayal. The very thing I had always sworn I would never do. That night, I walked home in a haze. The city lights blurred, my steps felt heavy, and my chest ached with guilt. I wanted to call Igor, to hear his voice, to remind myself that I still had something real. But I couldn't. The shame was too raw. When I finally crawled into bed, I stared at the ceiling, tears slipping silently down my face. I told myself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again, that I could bury it, pretend it hadn't happened, and go back to being the girl Igor trusted. But deep down, I knew the truth. Once you cross that line, you can never really go back. The innocence is gone. The trust, even if unbroken on the outside, is fractured within you. The next morning, Igor texted me, "Good morning, love. Have a great day." I stared at the screen, my heart shattering. Because he had no idea that while he was fighting for our future, I had just destroyed a part of it. And that was the moment I realized. Betrayal doesn't begin and end with an action. It lives inside you every day after, like a shadow you can't shake. The days after that night were some of the hardest of my life. On the surface, nothing had changed. Igor still texted me good morning. We still saw each other when he could carve out time from his insane schedule. To anyone looking in from the outside, we were the same couple we had always been. But inside me, everything was different. I carried the guilt like a second skin. Every time Igor smiled at me, every time he kissed me, every time he talked about our future, my chest tightened. I felt like a fraud, like I was wearing a mask that could slip at any moment. At first, I tried to bury it. I told myself it was just one mistake, that if I pretended hard enough, it would fade. But guilt doesn't fade. It festers. It whispers in the quiet moments. It twists every interaction into a reminder of what you've done. And then there was Alexei. He didn't push me, didn't demand anything from me, but he didn't step back either. He still lingered around me at work, still texted late at night. There was an unspoken understanding between us, like we were both pretending it was nothing, even though we both knew it wasn't. Sometimes when our eyes met across the office, I felt the same pull that had led to that first kiss. And that terrified me, because part of me didn't just feel guilty, it felt tempted. I tried to throw myself back into my relationship with Igor, to prove to myself that I could be the girlfriend he deserved. I cooked for him, surprised him at his apartment, sat through his endless stories about work, and for a while, it almost worked. I almost convinced myself that I could smother the mistake under layers of effort and devotion. But the truth kept bleeding through. There was one night in particular that broke me. Igor had fallen asleep on the couch, completely drained from work. I sat next to him watching him breathe, and I felt this overwhelming wave of love and sorrow at the same time. He looked so peaceful, so trusting, and I realized that he would never suspect me. He believed in me completely. That was when I started crying. Silently, my shoulders shaking, as I tried not to wake him, because I knew that if he ever found out, it would shatter him. And yet, I didn't stop. That was the cruelest part. Despite the guilt, despite the tears, I didn't cut ties with Alexei. I told myself we could just be friends, that the kiss was a one-time mistake. But I kept texting him. I kept finding excuses to be near him at work. And slowly, almost inevitably, the line blurred again. I was living two lives. With Igor, I was the loving girlfriend, supportive and steady. With Alexei, I was the girl craving excitement, attention, validation. And the worst part was that both versions of me felt real. But the more I tried to balance them, the more the guilt consumed me. I stopped sleeping properly. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, terrified Igor would somehow find out. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. I used to believe betrayal was a single act, a choice you make once. But now I understood the truth. Betrayal is a cycle. Every day you hide it, every lie you tell, every moment you pretend nothing happened, it all becomes part of the betrayal. And eventually, something had to give. Because secrets like mine don't stay buried forever. I always knew deep down that the truth wouldn't stay hidden forever. Secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface, no matter how tightly you try to bury them. Still, when it finally happened, it felt like the ground was ripped out from under me. It was a Tuesday night. Igor had asked me to come over after work. He seemed quieter than usual when I arrived, but I assumed he was just tired. We ate dinner together, and for a moment I let myself believe things were normal again. That maybe the storm inside me was mine alone, and he would never have to know. After dinner, he sat me down on the couch. His face was serious, his eyes searching mine in a way that made my stomach twist. "Anna," he said slowly, "is there something you need to tell me?" My heart dropped. I forced a laugh, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" He didn't smile. He just handed me his phone. And there it was. A screenshot. A message I had sent to Alexei late one night. Innocent enough on the surface, but intimate in tone. "Wish you were here." My blood ran cold. "Where did you—" I started, my voice trembling. "Doesn't matter," he interrupted. His tone wasn't angry. It was worse. It was calm. Too calm. "Just tell me the truth. Is there something going on between you and him?" I froze. In that moment, 1,000 lies rushed through my head. I could have said it was a joke, a misunderstanding, that I didn't mean it. But, looking into Igor's eyes, I couldn't bring myself to add another lie on top of all the others. So I nodded. Just once. I watched the pain wash over his face, and it felt like I had stabbed him with my own hands. He leaned back, rubbed his temples, and whispered, "I trusted you, Anna. More than anyone." Tears blurred my vision. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear. I love you, Igor. I do." "Then why?" His voice cracked. "Why him? Why this?" I had no answer. Because how do you explain something you don't even fully understand yourself? That it wasn't about love? That it wasn't about replacing him? That it was about me? My restlessness? My selfishness? My weakness? "I was lonely," I finally whispered. "I felt like you weren't really here anymore." And he noticed me. The silence that followed was unbearable. Igor stood up, walked to the window, and stared out. His shoulders trembled, and for the first time I saw him cry. "I was killing myself for our future," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought we were on the same team." I reached for him, but he pulled away. That hurt more than anything. The night ended with me leaving his apartment, my face wet with tears, my chest hollow. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just asked me to go. That quiet dismissal cut deeper than any explosion of anger ever could. When the door closed behind me, I knew something inside us had shattered beyond repair. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And now, the person I loved most in the world looked at me like a stranger. The days after Igor found out felt like living in a fog. Everything slowed down, blurred around the edges. I kept waiting for him to call, to text, to say that maybe we could fix this. But the silence was absolute. And in that silence, I realized I had lost him. At first, I tried reaching out. I sent long messages explaining, apologizing, begging him to meet me so we could talk. I told him I loved him, that what happened didn't mean I loved him any less. He never replied. The only time he did respond was with one short message. "You made your choice." And he was right. Alexei, on the other hand, was still there. He asked me how I was, told me he didn't regret what happened, that maybe we could try something together. But the truth is, I never wanted him. Not in the way I wanted Igor. What I wanted was the feeling he gave me. Attention, validation, that spark I thought I was missing. Without that context, without the secrecy, he wasn't the answer. So, I cut things off with Alexei. I told him I needed space, that it had all been a mistake. He didn't fight me. Maybe he knew it too. What lingered wasn't him. It was the wreckage I'd left behind. The weeks turned into months, and slowly I accepted that Igor wasn't coming back. He threw himself deeper into work, surrounded himself with friends, and eventually stopped acknowledging me altogether. Mutual friends told me he was doing better, but I could hear the bitterness in their voices when they looked at me. I had gone from being the girl everyone thought was perfect for him to the girl who betrayed him. And me? I carried the weight. Every morning, every night, every quiet moment in between. It's one thing to fear betrayal. It's another to know you've become the betrayer. That realization changes you. It forces you to see the parts of yourself you don't want to admit exist. For a long time, I hated myself. I replayed that night at the office 1,000 times, wishing I could undo it. Wishing I had walked away, called Igor, chosen differently. But no amount of wishing changes the past. What I've learned since then is this. Love is not just about how you feel in the good moments. It's about the choices you make in the hard ones. And I failed. I let loneliness and insecurity push me into a decision that destroyed something beautiful. I don't share this story to excuse myself. There are no excuses. What I did was wrong, and I will carry that with me always. I share it because I know there are others who might be standing on the edge of the same line I crossed. And if they hear this, maybe they'll step back before it's too late. As for Igor, he deserves better than what I gave him. Maybe one day he'll find someone who never makes him question his worth, someone who will stand by him the way I should have. And me? I'm still figuring it out. I'm learning to live with my choices, to rebuild myself into someone I can respect again. It's not easy, but it's the only path I have left. If there's one thing I know for certain now, it's this. Betrayal doesn't just break the person you hurt, it breaks you too. And sometimes the hardest part isn't losing them, it's losing the version of yourself you thought you were. Thanks for sharing this moment with me.